All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to yet another Power Place Summit Wednesday webinar. I'm CJ Oberthauser. I'm the Director of Training and Placemaking here at Grossmont, Rhode Island. And I'm joined today by these fine gentlemen listed here on this slide. We're here to talk about Grayfield redevelopment, but I'll let them speak toward that when they get going. For now, I'll just say really glad we're able to have you all here online. Obviously, we wish we could be having this in person. But like I say every week, really glad that this platform allows for more participation over all of these webinars and panels, and that these topics are being able to be thought about every week rather than having to choose from a menu of panels in an in-person summit. So we are grateful for that kind of silver lining of this platform. And we do have these panels every single Wednesday morning for about another month through the end of September. So you can check a full list of those panels on our website and get yourself signed up for whichever ones sound good to you. On September 25th, after our Wednesday webinars have completed, we're going to have a half-day plenary. And that's going to feature Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, as well as award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and Brookings Institution. And we have some other components of that day that we'll announce pretty shortly. And one of those components is going to be our awards program, which we'll be showing some, the videos that we typically show in person. We'll be showing them online and presenting our award winners on that day. So we hope you'll join us for that. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without our sponsors. So we're happy to be able to give some thanks to them here online. And in addition, we have full speaker bios on our website. If you want to learn more about these folks today or any of our previous panelists, you can head there and check that out. And all of our webinars are actually also approved for one AICP credit for all you planners out there seeking those. It's a little different than normally. Just head to the AICP website and you should be able to log it pretty easily. So this one is included in that list if you need those credits. And we welcome all of your questions. Just use the Q&A function right here in Zoom to send those in whenever you have them. And we're going to reserve a few minutes at the end for addressing all those questions. So please send them in whenever you have them, and we'll be happy to get to them later. And the last thing I'll say is this webinar is being recorded. So if you missed some of it or you have to duck out, you'll be able to access it pretty shortly. We'll be sending it out shortly after we're done today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Shawn to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss how to transform unused malls and shopping centers into vibrant mixed-use centers. As you said, my name is Shawn Martin. I'm a principal and civil engineer with Fuss & O'Neill in Providence. I've spent about the past 25 years primarily focused on redeveloping and repurposing brownfields, grayfields, and urban properties into mixed-use places and also public spaces such as parks. Our discussion today is about what to do with the plight of today's suburban shopping center and mall. And it's something that we struggled with, particularly in the context of today's watershed moments surrounding racial injustice, the coronavirus pandemic, and both environmental and economic sustainability. Shopping centers and shopping malls in particular kind of have this negative connotation about consumerism because it's been done at the expense of our downtowns, at the expense of the environment, and it has also perpetuated the marginalization of people of color and the poor. Our session today is not a technical one in the respect of we're not looking at the history of how malls and shopping centers came to be, an analysis of Euclidean zoning of the early 20th century, or the post-World War II glut of consumerism. This is more about how we can repurpose these wonderful opportunities, these gray fields, And really, the ultimate goal is that we can all walk away with the idea that we can create bold plans and take bold actions to make our downtowns and our communities better, to create equal opportunities for everyone, and to also create a vibrant economy. We have three guest speakers joining me today, as CJ had mentioned. Each one of them is going to speak to three goals that we have for today's section. Firstly, we'd like you to learn about what's happening and what's forecast in the commercial real estate market. To do that is Mike O'Mara, who's a Senior Vice President of the U.S. Capital Markets Net Lease Group at Avison Young. Mike has worked in commercial real estate for more than 30 years in all phases of brokerage and advisory analysis. He has done investment sales, 1031 exchanges, feasibility analyses, development, and site selection. He's also actively involved in 3 of the U.S. Department of Commerce designated opportunity zones and working with a host of economic development agencies, sponsors, and investors in both New England and nationally. And Mike is also an active member of the Smart Growth America's Locus organization in Boston. Secondly, we'd like you to understand some of the basic legal issues associated with Grayfields redevelopment. Rob Pellegrini is going to take us through that session. And he is the president, managing partner, and founder of PK Boston Law. His practice focuses on real estate development, land use, leasing, condominium development, and business and contract law. Rob has notable experience, in particular with large national retailers in dealing with zoning, land use, lease, environmental, and permitting issues. He's been featured in the Boston Globe, Forbes, U.S. News and World Report, and also the Associated Press on legal and small business matters. Lastly, we'd like to take you through some of the things that municipalities can do to redevelop Grayfields and how to make them into vibrant mixed-use centers. And to do that is Bill Fazzoli, who is the Director of Planning and Economic Development in East Providence, Rhode Island. Bill is responsible for expanding the opportunities for job creation and housing, and at the same time as expanding the city's tax base. Bill served on the city's waterfront commission since 2006 and became its chair in 2019. And that commission is responsible for the redevelopment of about 300 acres of property in the city. And Bill also brings some great experience as a financial and economic advisor through many communities throughout New England. Before we get into some of the discussions, we want to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. And many of the attendees may be familiar with the term Grayfield. And Grayfield is simply an underutilized or abandoned commercial property. And a lot of us see them in our everyday lives as the big box retail stores, strip malls that have many or several buildings or perhaps several tenants in a single building. But that also includes the traditional large scale enclosed mall. And I also want to clarify that Grayfield with an E is also acceptable. They're used interchangeably by many groups, including Congress for the New Urbanism and many others. Grayfield with an E tends to be the UK version. This photograph also epitomizes what a Grayfield is. There's vast areas of parking. There's very little open and green space, and there's usually massive buildings that are occupied by national retailers. And in the photograph, you see some of those labeled as Walmart, Apex, Macy's, and Sears. This Swansea Mall was built in 1975. It actually closed in 2019. And through that period of time, many regional and national retailers occupied the spaces there. It was acquired in 2001 by an equity firm. And sometime after that, well, interestingly enough, Walmart also moved onto the site. And at the same, during the same time frame, Apex, which was a Rhode Island retailer, closed its doors from the property. 10 years later, in 2011, Walmart moved from its mall space, there was a wing of the mall, onto a subdivided property in its own freestanding building. And that wing was subsequently demolished. And I think what's interesting about this particular case is that when the property was subdivided, the mall owner agreed to some restrictions on the mall property as part of the transaction with Walmart. What this transaction included were some restrictions that the mall could not implement certain uses such as pharmacies, gas stations, entertainment venues like theaters, recreation, bowling alleys. No alcohol was permitted on the property. In addition, there could be no cafeterias or food service or even grocery stores. So the types of retail and uses that would be permitted on the property were very, very limited at the time of this transaction. In addition, the property was zoned for commercial shopping center uses only. Beyond that, in 2019, as I said, 8 years later, Macy's left the mall property, and the mall was sold at auction for less than 3.5% of its sale price in 2001. You know, some of the issues associated with Grayfields that affect our communities, the most obvious one, it seems, is that there's a loss of real estate and tax revenue to the community. So even though the community needs to provide fire and police services to the property, there is essentially no tax revenue that's commensurate with the scale of these types of developments. They also tend to lead to lower community appeal for investors. They have the appearance of blight and lack of investment. They also can lead to problems with retaining residents or attracting new residents to the community. And as I shown you in the prior slide, they're largely impervious sites with very little green space. And they tend to have issues associated with stormwater runoff. They contribute pollutants to the receiving waterways. And they also can contribute to the heat island effect through these massive impervious areas. They also can lead to lower property values, degradation of the public realm in the adjacent streets. And as I said, the safety of residents on the property because of the attractive nuisance factor is also a problem. Some of the challenges for the vibrancy or success of shopping centers has to do, in some cases, and in many cases, with the scale of the property and also the type of community in which it's located. Many smaller and lower mall centers or shopping centers that are located in lower to middle income communities really struggle against these large centers that are located in more affluent communities. And then there's the fact that the US is really over retailed. Even though the occupancy rates are relatively high, I believe 93% was a figure that I had read recently. The US has about 23.5 square feet per capita versus 16.4 for Canada and less than 5 for the UK, Italy, Spain, and France. We also know that when the large retail tenants leave a shopping center, the Sears, the Macy's, it leads to a spiral loss of some of the smaller tenants. And that declining revenue over time leads to disinvestment by the mall owner. And this is a clear sign of a mall in distress, and it's a clear sign of an imminent failure. So these are things that communities really need to pay attention to while they're happening and before they actually lead to a failure. Some of these properties we know are at locations that are going to be significantly affected by climate change. And an excellent but unfortunate example is the Warwick Mall in Rhode Island, which was flooded in the 2008 floods, or 2011, now I'm forgetting. But in any case, we believe Grayfields are also going to increase because of the loss of revenue to retail centers. And lastly, or at least not leastly, zoning. As I mentioned, the Swansea Mall example, many times zoning prohibits mixed uses. They don't allow for residential uses in some of the services that you might find in a downtown area. So really the diversity that's needed to make a shopping center sustainable is not allowed. And what ends up happening is a promotion of this idea of replacing kind succession, where one use is replaced by the exact same use, but a different brand down the road. And here's a reality that we can all recognize, that retail continues to change. This evolution from the New Seabury Shopping Center of the mid-1960s in Mashpee, Massachusetts on the left versus today's economy on the right. This is something that's going to continue to change. And as you can see from the data that was acquired by the U.S. Department of Commerce, during the first quarter of 2020, retail sales or e-commerce sales accounted for about 12% of the total retail economy in the US. That jumped to about 16% towards the end of that first quarter. And most of that has been attributed to online grocery sales as a result of folks being quarantined at home and doing some online shopping. But the trend here is clear. The future of retail is really being driven by e-commerce, and that these malls need to diversify if they're in any way going to compete against the e-economy. The brighter side of this discussion, however, is that Grayfields, because of their location and because of how they were built, offer some great retrofit opportunities. This photograph is of that same site we saw of the Seabury Strip Mall, and this is Mashpee Commons in Mashpee, Massachusetts. A great example of new urbanism, of mixed use, and one of the main reasons that Grayfields offer great opportunities is that they tend to be located on arterial streets or very close to highways. So they make excellent sites for transit-oriented development. Because they have such vast land areas in large buildings that aren't necessarily suitable for complete reuse, they offer opportunities to build diverse and equitable types of housing. They also can host community and art centers, pocket parks, and many times they lack connections to the neighborhoods that surround them, and instead have very few driveways and are more auto-oriented. But again, to make them sustainable community centers, they also need to be walkable and bikeable. During the retrofit process, greening of the watershed, the incorporation of stormwater treatment practices to help improve water quality of receiving streams is very important and actually very easy to do. And in addition to that sort of resilient design and construction practice, some of the buildings can be reused and then in some ways retain some of that stored energy that we use to manufacture them, but also reduce the amount of landfill waste that they generate if we were going to do a complete demolition of the property. I'm going to turn over the presentation to Mike now, and Mike is going to lead us through a discussion about the real estate market, where we stand today, and also where we are looking for the future.
Thanks, Shawn. Let me just pull up my slides here. Let's see. Whoop. How do we do that again, Shawn, as far as getting
from beginning?
There we go. There we go. Well, thank you very much, Shawn. That was a great introduction to and segue into my piece of the panel here, and it actually gave me some things to think about and talk further about. I First of all, my name is Mike O'Mara. I'm with Avison and Young in Boston, Senior Vice President of a U.S. Capital Markets team. And I've been networking with John for a couple of years in the world of smart growth and opportunity zones, and that's how I was extended the invitation to this panel. And clearly, the retail arena landscape has been changing, much due to older concepts, older properties, and the advent of e-commerce. And so a lot of these issues we were already facing, but with COVID and the pandemic, it has accelerated everything in our world and how we view not only retail real estate, but commercial real estate. And I think this applies across the board, but for the purposes of our webinar today, we're talking about what we call outdated regional type malls. And Swansea in particular is a great example because I'm very familiar with that market. To give a little step back to add a little more context, the first part of my career, about a dozen years, I spent working for corporate retailers here in New England, which entailed doing site selection. And the whole methodology of site selection ties into how these malls were in these markets were selected and developed. And so it's given me some good context knowing that I've been into Swansea, I've negotiated some deals in that market, and how retailers evolved and grew in most instances in the suburban marketplace was in and around the areas of these enclosed malls. Now, without going into the history, like Shawn said, of how malls came about, the one thing that always had driven mall development were the anchor tenants. And those were the J.C. Penney's, Lord & Taylor, Sears, these really, national institutional mall operators of mass merchandise that would be situated at essence, four entranceways of the malls in most cases. And they were the anchor, and that's what the developers built the malls around, and then they would lease up all the small space. In the case of Swansea, where you're using a large, massive land, when you got more urban type markets, that's when the vertical integration of malls started to evolve, going 2, 3, 4 stories sometimes, depending on whether it's an urban market or a suburban market. So in this case, though, where the vast majority of the pain is coming from, and is going to continue to, where we're going to continue to see it, is the B class and C class malls that are all falling into some level of distress. And Swansea, again, is a great example because fast forward to today, that mall probably would not have been built. But what's really, where's the challenge come? Where are the issues coming from? It's the retail industry collectively, and e-commerce, and the changing consumer patterns and habits, the change in demographics, the change in infrastructure. So I think as we move forward, one thing to keep an eye out, and this was just, a snapshot for 2020, first half of the year, and there's 26 retailers that filed for bankruptcy so far. And that trend is going to continue, and it's going to accelerate. The ones that are really making the biggest news oftentimes are these big anchor tenants. Steinmart is not up here, but Lord & Taylor, Brooks Brothers, which is, was a staple in a lot of these malls. J.C. Penney, I've got J.C. Penney twice. Neiman Marcus, Pier 1. That's just to name a few of the bankruptcies. And here's a projection of potential retailers that will file, again, which will impact a lot of malls and power centers and shopping centers. AMC, you know, what's it going to feel like to go back to the movies if people decide they want to? Bed Bath & Beyond, they're a category killer, and that goes into power centers and how power centers evolved because, you know, the malls were the anchor in the marketplace, and these big box retailers were not going to be able to, you know, get a place in the mall. So they built in and around the mall area. Look at fitness, LA Fitness. You know, that I think every fitness operator is challenged right now. And the interesting thing on a lot of these B and C class centers is that fitness was a great backfill to other box space that had become vacant. And now those spaces are closed. We look at Guitar Center and Gap. So one of the big strategies you're seeing right now with the institutional mall owners, which Swansea wasn't, but there are a handful of malls in New England that are institutionally owned. Simon Property Group is number one, and they are actually buying the retailers out of bankruptcy to try and keep them afloat. And there's a lot that can go behind that. A lot that's behind that. I'm not going to dive too much into what's going to happen. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But as it relates to Swansea, I decided to focus on what I consider 3 malls that are in question, 2 for sure. Emerald Square Mall, when that was built over in North Attleboro, that was an A mall. You know, when it was first constructed, I think it was early 80s, and New England Development who did a lot of these malls in New England. Silver City Galleria in Taunton, that mall was just sold at auction recently. Dartmouth Mall, which is right down the street on I-95, that one is very similar to Swansea because it's one level, it's sprawled out. And if you look at the retail quarter, you have every retailer in that marketplace as you do Swansea and a lot of these other markets. And then I put a question mark, Providence Place. I mean, that's right downtown. That was Providence's jewel. It will be interesting to see how that evolves as we go forward. So we know we have a problem, and Shawn's engaged with his client in Swansea, and they've got this master plan that was in place before COVID, and it will be interesting to see what happens and how that evolves going forward. But there is one mall in Worcester called the Greendale Mall, which was sold in foreclosure auction, and they're in the process with their master redevelopment plan. If I had more time, I would have pulled some info up to show it. But the plan on the surface, from what I understand, is kind of the demall portions or all of it and turn it into a mixed use of Worcester's got a great biotech and medical industry and sector there with some workforce housing. And then there will be a different type of retail concept. So I believe that Greendale Mall could be an example or a model for these other centers and for planners out there to take a look at. But we need the local government, we need the planning agencies to be involved and really look forward on the new strategies that are going to be required to redevelop these properties. And I know Swansea has been very proactive because they knew they had this huge opportunity to repurpose that center. And so they have been very active as far as zoning and permits and things like that affect the whole economics of a sponsor or developer coming in to redevelop. You know, let's talk a little bit about the retail ownership perspective and who are they. Most of these larger mall owners, if you get into Natick Mall, Copley, Providence Place, you know, those malls were owned and operated. The sponsors were more regional developers, but their partners on the capital side were REITs, pension funds, private equity sponsors. And there's an issue that's happening in the mall world is that most of these malls were financed, their debt financing was through CMBS debt, which stands for commercial mortgage-backed securities. And that's Wall Street's method of raising large sums of capital through largely institutional type investors, mutual funds, life companies, and they pool these funds in a structured finance vehicle and they sell them as bonds. And those bonds are traded on a regular basis. But what we're seeing now is the lowest, the BP holder of the bond is usually the special servicer class who has the most risk and ultimately can take control of the property and foreclose and then sell it or reposition it. One of the bigger issues that we're seeing right now, and that it really, and Shawn touched on this in particular to Walmart, is way back when they didn't really think long and hard, I guess, because Walmart was a 900-pound gorilla, as far as what they want to negotiate for use clauses. And so when these anchors go out, they have a lot of co-tenancy clauses, which allows the other retailers to opt out of their leases or restricts other uses from coming in. So what are some of the strategies looking forward? Well, there was a time when the brick and mortar, big box in particular, said if we don't need an e-commerce strategy, and that has changed. And the companies today, Target, a handful of other companies that Best Buy that have a strong brick and mortar presence and an e-commerce strategy, those are the winners today. And they're also looking at is, well, we don't need all this real estate now. So they're looking at conversion of last mile delivery, which you would normally think of as an industrial type space, but now they're turning their own stores into their last mile. So, just briefly, the smaller mom and pop Main Street retailers are struggling. And I think there's a lot of pain there that we can't lose sight on how we help them out. And they clearly were hurt, when retail moved to the suburbs and malls and so forth. The other question is who's going to absorb these vacancies? And back in the day when there's Caldors and Bradley's, there were companies like Target, Kohl's, a vast majority of concepts that came in to backfill existing space, and then they built new space. Today, there's no one really to come and fill these spaces. So there has to be a redevelopment play, a long-term vision on how you reposition these assets in the Grayfield space. So that comes down to, as I referenced, the gyms and indoor theaters and stuff like that. They're all, basically shut down because of COVID and social distancing. And it's really hard to say what will happen there, and in particular, how the consumer pattern and habits will change going forward. But it comes down to, at the end of the day, is, how do we repurpose and redevelop? And I think you'll see a lot of the last mile and distribution. I think those are trends that are going to be coming forth. So who are the winners? It's service. It's essential retail. Target, TJX, Aldi. There are new formats being formed right now that will come into the marketplace, and that will be interesting to see where they go. But I'm confident to say that they won't have to go into C markets, and maybe even it'd have to be a strong B plus to go into some of these markets. So I'm being redundant, but we're going to have a lot of square footage in the retail real estate business that will need to be repurposed. I'll talk briefly on Main Streets. This is the last slide. You can't really read it, but for anyone that wants to understand how CMBS debt works, this is a report. In particular, this is, I think, Emerald Square Mall. So that's my presentation. And welcome to speak with anyone afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. We'd like to turn the presentation over to Rob now to talk about some of the legal issues, challenges, and opportunities that are faced by Grayfields. Rob?
Good morning, everyone. Rob Pellegrini here. PK Boston Law, just a little quick explanation of what we do. We're located in Bridgewater, Plymouth, and Newton, primarily a commercial real estate firm and business firm. And I've just happened to have a lot of experience with revitalizing mills. I worked with Cumberland Farms for several years and then moved to a firm in North Andover, just as a lot of Grayfields were becoming available there. And then moved the practice to Bridgewater, where, as everybody knows, there's, Southeastern Mass and Northern Rhode Island seem to have a lot of vacancies in mills. So I'll just see if I can share a screen here. And are we doing it? Hopefully, yes.
Yes, you're good, Rob.
Okay. So just real quick, I actually wanted to just quickly talk about, before we get to this, is we have, obviously everybody knows this, a lot of outdated regulations in New England, where pretty much you're forced, when you're entering into the project, to see what you need for variances. And it's usually a pretty long list. I had an example. Recently, there was a redevelopment in Taunton. It's called the Reed and Barton facility. And it's 14 and a half acres combined. There's 8 parcels actually that are were never properly merged. And throughout that 14 and a half acres, they had 3 parking areas, 26 buildings, some of them really dating back to the early 1800s. And what ended up happening is a national firm came through and purchased it in bankruptcy for, well, this is public record, so $100,000. And, talk about a great opportunity, it seems, but as you all know, these projects take a long time, and those old buildings definitely require a lot of care. So the grand scheme there was really just to get medical offices, residential housing, storage, artist lofts, musicians. And what ended up coming out of that was a lot of light industrial, which is, I think, a fairly novel concept now, but it works really well in these scenarios because, for one thing, they don't require a lot. Their traffic generation is fairly light, and it's just sort of an easier move and seems to work pretty well. So oddly enough, in Taunton, they have very favorable but outdated regulations, and the city was very happy that one of these areas was actually going to get done right. So what we ended up with there was a really good audience, very few variances needed, and we got through it pretty quickly. Obviously, in that case, the major issues, as often is the case, is you're dealing with a 200+ year old site, so they want to know a lot about runoff and where the sewer goes and general environmental issues. For example, there was a power plant there with some residual environmental issues. Of course, parking, lighting, and trash were on their minds as well. Okay, so when you don't have that, you obviously, you're kind of forced into, well, in Massachusetts, it's 40B, Rhode Island, it's, the Comprehensive Housing Production Rehabilitation Act or the Low and Moderate Income Housing Act. All of those require some work. And, there's a lengthy timeline with those as well. So basically, a 40B example recently is the West Newton Dunstan East project that utilized that. But basically there, it's a state guided process. And really what you need to do is basically solicit your input locally and then, basically put everything together, get appraisals for the project, and then file your application with the state, get an eligibility letter, and then come back. And you're talking, it's at this point well over a year to do all that. And with all this process, it's not inexpensive. So sometimes, at least in Massachusetts, we try to go with a friendly 40B, which is more of a town guided approval process where they sort of join you when you go to the state, and it's sort of like an amicable process, which can actually work, especially in a situation where the locality is excited to see something getting redeveloped. And then I wanted to praise some of the local communities that have been proactive with some of their zoning and land use principles. So these range basically from guidelines to rules. And I'm going to sort of jump ahead a little bit, but I sort of just wanted to make sure everybody understood these for what they are. They're, in a general sense, called form-based codes, and they're different from our traditional New England zoning, where you have to look at uses and setbacks and what uses are allowed in certain areas and what setbacks and transition zones might be required. With these form-based codes, they're more based on looking at predictable results and driven towards creating a high quality public realm. So it's more of a situation like what I'm going to go over with Cohasset, where they're really starting to look outside the box. Interesting side note is New Englanders don't like to look outside the box too often as compared to some more regional areas. So I'm finding it relatively interesting from a real lawyery perspective, how these are going to get utilized in practice, but we shall see. So Cohasset is a fine example. In their case, they say they're design guidelines, okay? And they give you examples. A plus, obviously, to this is when you're representing a developer, it's nice to get information up front rather than during the process about what they're actually looking to see. So they give their guidelines. It's easy reading. And this is a fairly good example, actually. They're always looking, in these smaller New England towns to, preserve and enhance historical and cultural heritage, promote mixed uses, which is easier said than done, of course. Promote variety, same deal there, easier said than done. They also look to sustainability. That's in 4.1.4 here. Interestingly enough, they do actually try to incorporate the state building code and, sort of ways to reduce and, minimize lighting and things like that. And I think Shawn touched upon this as well. A lot of these projects, not only are you reusing sort of a dead or underutilized property, but by increasing your actual, density into one place, there's always a lot of added benefits that the town can see, which helps your project move along as far as, reduced traffic trips and things like that, and shared parking, which I'll get into in a few minutes. Other items that they try to cover, okay, this is just showing you, in this case, they not only did they sort of lay out what they wanted to see, but they sort of split it up based upon what was around the zone. So this kind of works as an overlay, and based on the surrounding uses and what the surrounding areas looked like, they tried to segment it so it would sort of blend in better with what was there. And you can see the MBTA was fortunately present there, which is transit oriented, which is always helpful. They also took the time to do materials, texture, and color. I just happen to know from experience that at one time or another, at least Cumberland, Rhode Island, did this as well and provided it to their applicants. When I was on the planning board there, it was useful and very helpful to the applicants to get a pretty good understanding about what to present within their parameters if they wanted something that we were going to approve. Another, I'm going to just skip forward a little bit. Sidewalks and pedestrian networks. I think this helps too. This is present in most of these new codes. There's sort of an awareness that, people, even in the cold New England environments, will walk if it's it's a walk that feels safe, like you're not going to get run over by a car crossing a busy street or something. So these, as they get implemented more and more, I think it's going to be nice to see, how New Englanders deal with it during our less advantageous months. Okay, so this is an example in Cohasset of Cohasset Place. This is the before picture, very similar to what you were shown earlier in the presentation. And, this is the type of thing that came out of that. So, there are good things, and even in New England, I think a lot of these things are going to work. That actually reminds me, I have to give credit to Axiom Architects for providing some of these slides for me, as well as New England Development. Okay, so this is from North Andover, another good example and a place that I've done quite a bit of work in. So it was easy for me to sort of highlight and share. Really what you're seeing here is, guidelines again. They did a planned development zone, and they laid out just some general purposes, which none of these would surprise anybody. And then procedures, which really to me sound like a regular subdivision process, which is nice because I think for the applicants, it's a familiar process. So there's pre-application conference, you submit a preliminary plan, you get feedback early on. This is a project that resulted from this new zone in North Andover. And okay, so some of the minimum requirements that pop up, things like, again, this all sort of circles around. It's really dealing with whether or not the town wants it to sort of blend. So in this case, it said, if you're doing this in a residential zone, we want at least half of the use to be residential. They also wanted to look at parking. Parking was sort of novel. You don't get this everywhere. And let me just skip right forward to that. I can get back to that, but so what they had done with parking is they allow a shared parking. So everything basically, if you want to do that, is done with planning board approval via a permit. And basically what they allow you to do is borrow from neighboring or close by uses. And I think this works really well because, for example, the parking demand is going to be different for residential versus retail versus industrial versus entertainment. So this is a real practical way to reduce the impervious area that you need. And I think it's working well there. And it's certainly not creating any issues. But it also allows you to land bank. That's something as well that's not that novel, but it allows you to basically bank 40% of the space you might need in the case that things change. So I'm going to try to go backwards because a lot of these codes are also asking for some community area and some open areas. So I just pulled a couple slides from various projects. This one I might be Georgia or Ohio, but you understand the point. They're trying to create areas where it's nice and comfortable to walk. This would be obviously an outdoor venue. Keeping in mind that I'm running out of time, I think I'm gonna just skip forward a little bit so I can wrap up my presentation. This is a very nice, this is a very familiar project to many, showing sort of shared parking in the center. This is in Hingham. And what I like about this slide is it shows sort of that communal parking in the middle with everything surrounding it. It's good because they're sort of hiding the parking as well. This is an actual picture in use. Shows a lot more cars on the parking lot than it did in the pretty picture, but you get the point. Okay, so finally, I'm just gonna quickly wrap up with another form-based town, Situate, Massachusetts. Again, they split it up, surrounded it around public transportation as well. And what I sort of just quickly wanted to pull out here is, again, they're going to a lot of the same issues, but they concentrated a lot on transitional buffer zones, and because they didn't want to impact the neighborhood too much. So they talk about things that many of us have heard about in theory, but not used in practice. So these pedestrian frontage zones, transitional buffers, and it's sort of nice. You can get this online. It sort of gives you an idea about ways to make scale more of a gradual situation, which impacts the way people feel when they're walking around. And things that certainly us land use lawyers weren't trained necessarily to look at, but it does make our jobs a lot easier and a lot less time appealing things and more time permitting. So I will wrap it up there and stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it back to Shawn.
Thanks, Rob. At this time, I'd like to switch over to Bill so he can describe and talk about some of the things that the city of East Providence has been doing to retrofit and to repurpose Grayfield sites. Bill?
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. So what I'm going to do with the balance of my time is really just talk a little bit about the city's economic profile and how retail plays into that. Get into somewhat generic drivers of development are, and some that are more specific to retail and mixed-use development, and then get into some real case studies that are unfolding in front of our eyes right here in East Providence, close to downtown. So just to get started, I'm going to go ahead with sort of this first slide. Basically, many people might be familiar with East Providence. Our economic base has always been very strong in some very key anchor industries: manufacturing, medical and office, healthcare. That's been growing very well over the last few years. Financial services, we're home to three major financial services firms, operations, and cybersecurity and data analytics centers here in the city. So major source of employment. And as with most communities in New England and Rhode Island, the residential housing, single family and multifamily market has been extremely strong. And then, going forward, we're looking to really become a cornerstone of the offshore wind industry with some of our waterfront that's being redeveloped to take part in that emerging market sector. Retail presence has historically been modest in East Providence. Our existing retail is really contained to just a few 1970s, 1980s style plazas, which are all actually doing fairly well, and most are fairly well occupied. We do have some challenges that do remain on Newport Avenue and Narragansett Plaza, but there are proposals in front of the planning board and actually the city council that will help those situations. And most of our retail really consists in older central business districts. We've had 3 or 4 main streets in East Providence. Obviously, Taunton Avenue is the main street, but in addition to that, we have a number of commercial corridors that have become more mature, and we're seeing some new investment in those areas, especially among locally owned specialty restaurants that have been doing very well, and that's helping out spur some retail development. So just some generic components. Everyone can kind of relate to these from the planning world. What drives development, and really fiscal capacity and stability is more than ever. The pressure on municipal budgets stemming from COVID is going to be enormous, and it's going to probably take years before communities fully recover their revenue sources as a result of COVID, because of the losses in employment and so on. And really, fiscal capacity from an investor or developer is important because they want to make sure that the community that they're going to be working in is able to provide and maintain capital, operating services, and make capital investments, and really just represents a strong market for them to invest. Another key development driver is just make more sites available for development. We're finding that when an investor or a developer comes into town, they're looking to take over entire blocks available for development, not just single, storefronts. This just makes it easier for them to mobilize resources and justify their work in the community. So if they're working on several buildings at a time, it's just more cost effective for them. And of course, more flexible zoning options. We're finding that mixed use districts are really a preferred model for developers. We're finding that the residential market is so strong, especially the multifamily residential, that's able to support and sometimes subsidize retail operations. And I'll get into some examples about that later on. And also, the idea of allowing unnecessary variances or deviations in terms of setback, density, use, height, parking, and all of that, sort of make them by right. And rather than having an applicant have to go to the zoning board, which can take months and can become somewhat contentious, but allows a developer to go in with a certain game plan, sign leases, and make commitments to tenants. If he knows by right, he or she is able to do these, put these places into place. Obviously, some of the things that we all like to promote is in our city's local distinct advantages. Maybe if they're public amenities, recreational, or cultural assets, they're all very important. But right now, we're finding that a lot of developers are very, very interested in highlighting transit and walkability scores. They want places that people can get to via public transit, or they can just walk to. and then also that are around others like stores, they can continue their retail experience without having to get in the car again. And of course, having an orderly and timely review permitting process is something we all take for granted, but it's more than that. We like to take a more approach where we shepherd a proposal through the city system, where we'll have somebody who might be very knowledgeable in their particular line of business, say it's a brew pub or a restaurant or a craft store, but they know very little about how to operate a business. So early in the process, we work with a lot of people looking to establish retail businesses in the city and provide them a lot of market data, market studies, demographic data that will discuss some of the retail gaps in the community, some of the opportunities that are being underserved that they might want to consider. And we found that to be very useful. We use a software called Land Vision that provides very key demographic consumer behavior that we can make available to people who can see, if their product or business that they're proposing really is going to make sense. And then, of course, right now, as consumer confidence is really shaken, people are not spending money. All of the national numbers show that, and it's such a huge driver of our economy. It's something to be very wary of. We're seeing that successful retail operations here in the mom and pop central business districts are ones that are hyper local, ones that they're selling a product or an experience that can't be replicated online, that is something that relates to the immediate community. That might minimize their market that they can attract, but we find that that tends to have a lot of repeat customers. And one of the examples I think about in Providence is that Frog and Toad gift shop up on the West End. It's really obviously very hyper local to Providence or an island, but despite that, it has some very broad business. So we'll get into some case studies here. First one is on Taunton Avenue, which is right across from City Hall. Back in 2016, the city put in a special mixed-use overlay district, again, to encourage new opportunities for mixed-use developments with a storefront character. And this would allow, in the same development, residential, office, and retail structures to occupy street fronts. And again, it was to promote pedestrian and walkability. Permitted uses that were included here include cafes, galleries, live workspaces, things that sort of don't need a huge amount of space, a couple thousand square feet here or there, or even a couple hundred square feet. But it also would allow multifamily housing to be included in the development. The things that were prohibited were things that obviously we didn't want to see that would detract from the development, include auto body, self-storage, and of course those lovely stores that market their units at prices that are a flat fee or under a certain dollar point. We just didn't want to see those chain stores come into these districts. So as a result of that, right across from City Hall, if you're familiar, there was a block of buildings on Taunton Avenue, which to the left was an old printing group. And I think we all remember having to go to the printer and getting copies made and collating all of that back, 20 years ago. So, 25 or 30 years ago, this one business actually occupied about 4 business fronts. It was so busy. It has a large commercial printer, but with the advent of personal computers, and people, don't really rely on that. So on the right-hand side, you can see after the renovation of the building, and the building was vacant for a number of years, but because of the zoning change that was put in place, a local investor who owned a restaurant who wanted to diversify renovated the building. And you can see this on the right the building was post-renovation, and it wasn't quite occupied yet, but it's a much more attractive facade than it was there before. So on this particular development just opened in February of 2020, and it was 5 residential units, all which have been fully leased within weeks of opening. It's centrally located. You could see the amenities inside. It has all the modern amenities. Again, this was never a residential space. This was just storage space and equipment space. And so this was a very remarkable renovation by the developer here. And really what he's telling us is that the strong rents he's able to achieve from the residential apartments is able to support his retail uses. And again, within a month of him opening, within a few months of him opening the apartments, we were able to see this wonderful coffee shop open up right across from City Hall. again, in a vacant space that was vacant just a few months ago. And it's become a very big hit right in the central part of East Providence. It really is a very attractive place. It's nothing like it in East Providence, really. Even during COVID, it's still doing extraordinarily well. So we're very happy to see that. And adjacent to this unit is another retail shop that'll be opening up in the next few weeks. It's under renovations right now, so we're excited to see it find somebody else here. But this particular restaurant and coffee shop gets a lot of foot traffic. Right down the street from this particular plaza, over on Taunton Avenue, is a parcel that was vacant for about 12 or 13 years. It was the home of an old Lowe's Theater that was demolished, and the lot was vacant for a number of years. So what we're seeing here is a proposal to put in, again, a mixed-use development that includes 10 workforce housing, affordable housing units, along with some market rate units. But also, the parcel was rezoned to allow for live-work retail space on the bottom floor. So we're going to see this. There's a proposal in front of the city's waterfront commission to start construction early in 2021. So again, because of the relaxed zoning and the deviations given for allowed mixed uses, and some of the increase is allowed for density and height and parking relief, we're able to see this development take place, and it's going to be a really exceptionally well received, especially for the workforce housing components. This is a site, I don't have any renderings of this, but this is an old site in Riverside, Rhode Island. It's a former old block of, sort of the historic general convenience store. The current owner there operates 2 successful restaurants nearby in Riverside, and he has an interesting business model. He's been acquiring properties and securing tenants. So he's a developer, but he likes to rent out his space to future entrepreneurs. So he'll open up his space, and he'll work with a prospective lessee who will come in, and he'll teach them how to run a business. He'll take them under his wing, and really to show the community impact of running a local business. Some people might be a little jaded about working for corporate America or some of the changes that are going on in the world, that maybe that they want to spend some time opening and operating a small business right in their community that benefits the community directly. This particular developer was drawn to the area primarily because of the East Bay Bike Path. These sites are on the East Bay Bike Path. Sorry, that's my timer going off. But it's something that's a very walkable neighborhood. He again required some zoning relief and parking minimums and setbacks, but we're very excited that he's going to make this a destination area because of the proximity of the bike path, to become a social gathering and to include more restaurants and add a art focus to the development. This last one I'll discuss is on Newport Avenue, New Road. This is the lot that's been vacant for close to 50 years from what I told. At one time it served as a cemetery right in the middle of a commercial corridor and in a neighborhood. Since then it's been cleaned up and all of that has been removed. But we have a developer based out of Boston who's looking at coming in and putting a large multifamily unit in the back with a national grocer in the front, along with a gas convenience store. And he basically said the prior use was strictly commercial, but he said he couldn't make that work. So allowing for the mixed use and the residential to be on this property along with the commercial just makes for the project to be much more viable, and he's able to finance it with his local bank. So we're very excited. There's a hearing on this particular project on September 1st for the city council to formalize the zoning change. If that's takes case, the developer will be able to sign leases with his tenants, and he'll be moving on very quickly. So it's great to get this site moved along and get this parcel finally in a better use for the community. So, and again, lastly, this is a project that we're working on right now. This is a city-owned parcel that we took over from a tax title. It's a brownfield site down in Riverside. It was a home of a former jewelry company. The site's been remediated. The city's now accepting RFPs for the reuse of this property. The zoning, again, was changed for this particular parcel that we'd like to extend the entire commercial district here, not just this parcel. Again, giving relief for parking, density, height, setbacks, and so on. So we did receive one very compelling proposal right now, and we're reviewing that, but we hope to put this this parcel back on the tax roll. And, you know, right now, again, it's been vacant for a number of years, and it's an eyesore for the community. But again, it's right on the East Bay bike path, so there's a lot of positive possibilities for this parcel. So these are the things that you know, we've been in work with, and largely most of this was put in place by my predecessors here in the planning department. Many of you know them. They're very experienced professional planners. I'm just here to try to implement and execute some of the plans that they put up in place a few years ago. And we have an excellent planning staff here with a lot of long-term employees, and we're continuing to take this model, and we're actively looking to implement it in other parts of the city, because we're seeing some very positive feedback and reception from developers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Shawn.
Thank you very much, Bill. We had a few questions come in. I'm going to skip my closing remarks, and instead we'll jump right into the Q&A portion of the session, since we are really tight on time. One of the questions that came in is really directed for you, Bill. Particularly, there's been some discussion about the resurgence of restaurants in Riverside neighborhood of East Providence. And you had mentioned restaurants a few times in your presentation. What has the city done specifically to try and attract or support local restaurants, particularly in light of this challenging time for restaurants?
Yeah, actually, you know, we have we're on the first name basis of most old and new restaurants. I take it a point to go and visit every single one so I can get to know exactly what's going on. But we've provided some marketing campaigns for them. We've offered, working with local, the Arts Council, during COVID, we developed a program where people could buy gift cards at a discounted price that we help subsidize a little bit. But we're very open to restaurant businesses, again, because that's not an experience that could be replicated online. And Riverside is a great example. Also on Warren Avenue is a great Asian sushi place, and Waterman Avenue is a place that also is a great pizza place. And we're finding a lot of these new restaurants are the outcrop of the food truck industry. A lot of these food trucks are looking for a permanent home, and they're able to come and find a space in East Providence that's relatively affordable. Again, that we could work with them if there's any zoning or parking relief that our zoning board has been very open to and accommodating for that. So it is something that we take a special approach on and special focus.
You know, food trucks and the concept of pop-ups, especially on Grayfield sites, is a great opportunity to kind of host these sorts of these vendors, help create some of that vibrancy in neighborhoods in the city. We also got a question about where some of the resources that might be available to folks to look at about unused malls. We'll provide that information after the session. And we also had another question, and this is really for all the panelists. The question is, have we heard of large malls being reused as office space? And for example, this particular questioner says that he or she's read that the Emerald Square Mall was trying to accommodate office uses as part of the redevelopment project, but not sure if any progress has been made. So I wonder if any of the panelists are aware, perhaps Mike, about the progress there.
Yes, Shawn, that is something that I had heard too. But I think now with COVID, it could be, you know, I would suspect they'd have second thoughts until we get a clearer understanding of the new normal. What I do think are possible uses, much like what you're doing down in Swansea, would be multifamily type housing. I see a lot of demand in the medical office space as well.
Another attendee mentioned whether there were some neighborhood changes that could provide amenities to these shopping plazas with vacant spaces, and that there's been, I guess there's been some concern that there's been no real change in the couple of years that they have lived in the area. And I'm not sure what the exact question is, but you know, we hear about whether some of the amenity spaces, I think, is what's driving the question, is that developers can often or will often propose amenity spaces or public use spaces as part of their redevelopment. And what are municipalities perhaps doing to require developers to implement these commitments, I think is probably what it's coming down to. Perhaps that's a question for Bill. And I've seen this same problem before, is that the project is allowed to move forward, offer amenity spaces, but those amenity spaces are never built.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, right now, complementing open public amenities and all that is a big thing, and allowing it to become a gathering space. And that's exactly what the gentleman in Riverside is looking to do. So we're collaborating with him because he's on the bike path. We're also putting a lot of money in kind of dressing up the plaza there that is the intersection of the bike path at a key point. And we did get a Commerce RI grant to kind of leverage some money there to make it more of an attraction, to allow for a destination for people to come to, and while they're there, be able to support local restaurants. But most of the public amenities that we have in East Providence are municipally owned, and we're trying to leverage them, more importantly, like the bike path, to complement the retail operation.
Thank you. Bill, also another questioner asked about whether, you mentioned how developers are looking for transit and walkable development sites. What about bike paths?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we have a huge asset in East Providence where we've got this huge stretch of the bike path that goes through several key commercial districts in East Providence, including Warren Avenue, which we're developing an enhanced bike safety project that will allow people to get across Warren Avenue onto the bike path on Veterans Memorial Parkway. But yeah, that's something we're definitely keying in on. It's a huge asset, and it gets people close to our waterfront, and we're certainly focusing heavily on that. And that's really the driver behind the developments in Riverside, is the direct connection of the bike path to many of these parcels that are being renovated.
I know we mentioned Swansea a few times today, and Mike also talked about the efforts of the select board there to try and think about what the mall or that area could be, the area around the mall could be in the future. But really, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, those sorts of activities, and Bill alluded to it too, they need to happen before the signs of stress occur with a mall, really to allow these properties that may be underutilized or even heading for distress are able to transition to meet the market demands. So really to make them mixed use centers before they become Grayfields or run into failure. So that's one of the, there was another question that came in about, geez, there's these properties sitting all over the place that are vacant. What can we do about them? One of the things we can do is to start creating these plans that you heard about from all the presenters to actually facilitate mixed use development. And for that to happen, the typical commercial retail on an arterial is not often a very walkable space. So that's why it needs the partnerships of both the communities and the developers to kind of create that environment and to make it easy for not only the developer, but you make it easy for the community to get exactly what they want out of a development project. I think we're definitely out of time, and CJ, I don't know if you want to take over at this point, but we still have a couple of questions coming in. We can always address them offline, and then all the attendees will receive those answers.
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan if y'all don't mind doing that. And for anyone that does have questions that we're not able to get to right now, you can feel free to email me or John. I think you have either or both our emails, and we can forward them along to these guys as appropriate. But yeah, I just want to say before we sign off, thank you so much to you four guys so much. Great panel, great conversation. Thank you for the questions, folks. Thank you all for being here. And again, we'll be seeing probably a lot of you next week and the Wednesday after and so on. So thanks again for being here, and take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.